They say empires don't fall overnight. But on the dawn of May 29th, 1453, the world awoke to a silence that marked the end of 1,000 years. Constantinople, the shining crown of Christendom, the city once called the Queen of Cities, had fallen, and with its fall, something deeper died. The air over the Bosporus was thick with smoke and sorrow, the cries of battle fading into an eerie stillness that clung to the marble walls. For centuries, the Byzantine Empire had stood as the last living breath of Rome itself, a bridge between the ancient and the medieval. But that morning, when the great dome of Hagia Sophia echoed with the sound of foreign boots and shattered icons, the medieval world quietly closed its final chapter. Picture it, a city built on 7 hills, its skyline pierced by golden domes and soaring minarets, now trembling beneath the thunder of cannons unlike anything Europe had ever seen. Some said it was destiny, others said it was betrayal. But whatever it was, it changed the world forever. The final Byzantine emperor, Constantine XI, stood upon the crumbling walls as thousands of defenders, Greeks, Italians, even monks fought desperately against waves of Ottoman soldiers led by a 21-year-old sultan who believed God himself had granted him victory. The sultan's name was Mehmed II, and he came not just to conquer a city, but to claim a prophecy, the one that promised whoever held Constantinople would hold the world. That morning, the city's ancient gates were breached, its mighty walls torn apart by fire and iron. In the chaos, the people of Constantinople sought refuge in their holy sanctuary, believing angels would descend to protect them. But no angels came. Only the roar of cannons, the crash of doors, and the scent of burning incense mixed with blood. Sit back, relax, and imagine this moment, frozen in time, the final heartbeat of an empire, the last breath of the medieval age. Because this was not just the fall of a city, it was the death of an era and the birth of a new, uncertain world. And as dawn broke over the smoking ruins, the world took its first uneasy step into modern history. Next, we move to the siege itself, a story of faith, fire, and impossible endurance. The siege of Constantinople did not come without warning. For months before that fateful May morning, the people of the city had watched the horizon with growing fear. Across the narrow waters of the Bosporus, Mehmed II had been preparing something the world had never seen, an army, so vast it seemed to stretch from one edge of the sea to the other, and a weapon so terrible it could shatter the walls that had protected Rome's heirs for 1,000 years. They called it the Basilica, a cannon forged by the hands of a Hungarian engineer named Urban. It was said to be so massive that it took 60 oxen to pull it, and when it fired, the earth itself trembled. Each blast could send stone the size of a man crashing into the city's defenses, shaking the faith of all who heard it. Inside Constantinople, the defenders knew they were surrounded. Barely 7,000 men stood within the city, soldiers, monks, volunteers, and merchants, against an army of nearly 100,000. The sea, once their lifeline, was now blocked by an Ottoman fleet. Yet still, the city stood defiant. Each night, the streets glowed with candlelight as priests carried icons through the alleys, praying for divine intervention. The emperor, Constantine XI, walked among his soldiers, speaking softly, reminding them that they were not merely defending stone and mortar, but the last sanctuary of their faith. Some chroniclers say he fought without armor, ready to die with his city. Beyond the walls, Mehmed's army worked without rest. Engineers dug trenches, Sappers built tunnels to collapse the foundations, and archers darkened the sky with arrows. The air was filled with the smell of gunpowder, sweat, and fear. For weeks, the great cannon roared day and night, pounding at the ancient Theodosian walls until cracks began to spread like veins across their surface. Still, the defenders patched and prayed, each sunrise feeling more like a borrowed day than a victory. Some believed a miracle would come, a storm, a vision, an angel, something to save the Queen of Cities. But as each dawn arrived, it brought only smoke and the sound of drums. The siege had begun not just as a battle of armies, but as a war between faith and fate. And as the days passed, the city began to understand that even legends can bleed. Next, we moved to the secret tunnels beneath Constantinople, where shadows and silence held their own kind of war, while the cannons thundered above and the city's towers crumbled beneath the relentless assault. Another war unfolded in the darkness below. Beneath the cobblestones of Constantinople, the ground was alive with whispers, echoing footsteps, and the faint, rhythmic sound of metal scraping against stone. The Ottomans, relentless in their ambition, had begun digging tunnels long, suffocating corridors meant to breach the walls from below. By torchlight, their engineers and miners carved their way through the earth, hoping to emerge within the city and collapse its mighty defenses from underneath. It was a war of patience and silence, where victory belonged not to the strongest sword, but to the keenest ear. Within the city, Byzantine defenders discovered the threat. They sent their own miners into the labyrinth below, armed not with swords, but with buckets of water, oil lamps, and pickaxes. They listened, pressing their ears to the ground, feeling for tremors, straining for the faint vibration that betrayed an approaching tunnel. And when they found one, they struck. Beneath the city that was already half ruined above, men fought in cramped darkness, breathing the same air, sometimes separated by mere inches of dirt. They fought with daggers and torches, the flames flickering against sweating faces as the tunnels filled with smoke and screams. Some tunnels collapsed, burying both attacker and defender alive, sealing their struggle forever within the earth. Others were flooded intentionally, drowning entire Ottoman squads before they could reach the walls. It was a silent, unseen battle, desperate, brutal, and cruel. Above ground, the citizens continued to pray, unaware of the shadow war raging beneath their feet. The scent of burning pitch drifted from the towers, while inside Hagia Sophia, chants echoed through the vast dome, mixing with the distant thunder of cannon fire. The defenders held on, but exhaustion crept through their bones. Each day felt longer, each night more uncertain. And as the tunnels multiplied, so too did the fear. The fear that no wall, no prayer, no hope could hold forever. Still, Constantine refused to surrender. He believed the city was sacred, destined to outlast even this storm. But faith can only hold back fire for so long. Deep beneath the earth, the last of the counterminers set their torches to one final trap, flooding an entire tunnel with smoke and flame. For a moment, the ground trembled. Then, silence returned, but it was the kind that comes before something far worse. Next, we moved to the sea, to the night when fire met water and iron gates sealed the city's fate. While the walls groaned under the pounding of cannon fire and the earth trembled from hidden battles below, another front of the siege was waged upon the restless waters of the Golden Horn. Constantinople's defenders had chained off the harbour with a great iron barrier, a massive chain stretching across the mouth of the inlet, a desperate line of defence forged to keep the Ottoman fleet at bay. But Mehmed II was not a man who bowed to obstacles. To him, the sea itself was a battlefield, and he would bend it to his will. The Sultan ordered an audacious plan, one that would shock the world and crush the spirit of the defenders. In the dark of night, under the dim light of flickering torches, the Ottomans began hauling their ships over land. Yes, over land. More than 70 galleys were dragged across greased logs. Through the forests and hills above Galata, their wooden hulls moaning as men and oxen strained together. The sound of it echoed through the night, the creak of timber, the shouted commands, the thud of logs striking earth. By morning, when the sun rose over the hills, the defenders stared in disbelief. The Golden Horn, once thought impenetrable, now shimmered with Ottoman sails. The enemy fleet had appeared behind the chain. The sea, their last sanctuary, was lost. Panic swept through the city. Fires erupted as Greek and Venetian ships clashed with the Ottoman galleys, their arrows setting the water ablaze. The sea burned a black, oily inferno where men screamed and vanished beneath the waves. The smell of smoke and salt mixed with blood as the defenders tried to fight back, but they were too few. Above the chaos, the Sultan watched calmly, his eyes fixed on the city's walls, knowing the final act was drawing near. The emperor ordered prayers and processions, hoping for a sign, a miracle, something. Yet the sky remained silent, heavy with ash. That night, the glow of burning ships lit the sky red, casting shadows that danced across the domes and spires. The people whispered that perhaps the end had already come, that the city's light, once said to be eternal, was fading. And though the defenders still fought, they could feel it in their hearts. The walls were breaking, the sea was burning, and their time was running out. Next, we moved to the night before the final assault, when the candles burned low, and every prayer felt like a farewell. The night before the final assault was a night unlike any other in Constantinople's long and storied life. The city, bruised, bloodied, but not yet broken, stood beneath a sky of stillness, the kind that comes before the storm. The fires from the siege flickered along the horizon, casting a red glow over the sea walls and domes, while inside the city, every street and square was lit with candlelight. The people knew. Everyone knew. The end was coming with the next dawn. And so, the Queen of Cities prepared for her death in silence and in prayer. In Hagia Sophia, the great church that had stood for nearly 1,000 years, men and women gathered together, nobles beside beggars, soldiers beside monks, all kneeling under that vast golden dome. The Emperor, Constantine XI, entered not as a ruler but as a man among his people. He prayed, confessed, and wept with them. Chroniclers say he asked forgiveness from his enemies and embraced his friends one last time. The choir sang softly in Greek, the ancient hymns rising like smoke toward the mosaics of Christ and the Virgin. Some believed they could see tears on the faces of the icons, glistening in the candlelight. Outside, the air was heavy with the scent of salt and smoke, and the low murmur of soldiers preparing for the final stand. The walls were manned, the gates reinforced with what little strength remained. Every man knew his place, and none expected to see another sunrise. In the emperor's palace, the final orders were written, but even the ink seemed to dry slowly, as if reluctant to mark the last chapter of an empire that had outlived so many others. Across the camp of the Ottomans, the sound of drums began to rise, slow and steady, like a heartbeat. Mehmed II walked among his soldiers, promising paradise to those who died and glory to those who lived. The young sultan was calm, his eyes bright with purpose. He had waited his whole life for this moment, to take the city that Alexander, Caesar, and countless others had dreamed of conquering. In Constantinople, the candles burned lower. The chants grew quieter. Somewhere in the darkness, the first cannon roared, its sound rolling across the Bosporus like thunder. The hour had come. The city held its breath, and the last night of Byzantium slipped into history. Next we moved to the dawn that followed, when the walls fell, and the world changed forever, before the sun rose on May 29th, 1453. The air around Constantinople was already trembling with the sound of drums. From the Ottoman camps came a roar, tens of thousands of voices chanting in unison, calling upon God and destiny. The final assault had begun. In the pale light of dawn, the city's defenders stood upon the battered walls, their armor dented, their faces streaked with soot and exhaustion. Below them, the plain was alive, a sea of banners, steel, and fury. Mehmed II had unleashed everything he had: waves of soldiers, janissaries, artillery, and sappers, all moving as one unstoppable tide. The cannons, massive and merciless, opened fire. Each blast shook the ground, sending chunks of the Theodosian walls crashing down in clouds of dust. The air was thick with smoke, arrows, and the screams of the wounded. The first assault came from the irregular troops, wild, desperate men promised plunder and forgiveness for their crimes. They rushed forward, ladders in hand, climbing over the corpses of those who had fallen before them. The defenders fought them back with boiling oil, stones, and crossbow bolts, pushing them down again and again. The second wave came from the Anatolian troops, more disciplined, more determined. They filled the trenches, braving the fire raining from above, while the defenders struggled to patch the breaches faster than they could crumble. And then, in the chaos and dust, the third wave began to move, the Sultan's elite, the Janissaries. Silent at first, they advanced in perfect order, their armor glinting in the dim light, their faces unreadable. Behind them, Mehmed himself rode forward, watching with cold precision. Inside the city, the bells of Hagia Sophia began to toll, calling the people to prayer, to faith, to hope, but even the sound was drowned beneath the roar of cannon and steel. Emperor Constantine fought among his men, sword in hand, his crimson cloak torn and stained. He refused to flee. He refused to surrender. The battle raged across the walls like wildfire, and for a moment, just a moment, the defenders held. The city that had stood for 1,000 years still breathed. But as the smoke thickened and the breaches widened, a sound like a thunderclap tore through the air. The great gate of St. Romanus had fallen. The enemy was inside. Next, we moved to the fall itself. The moment the unthinkable became reality, and the Queen of Cities was no more. The moment the St. Romanus gate gave way, time seemed to fracture. Dust and smoke filled the morning air, turning dawn into darkness. The defenders on the wall looked down and saw the unthinkable, the Ottomans pouring through the broken gate, their banners rising like a tide of black and red. Trumpets blared, swords flashed, and the sound of steel against steel echoed through the heart of the city. The Byzantines tried to form a line, but the breach was too wide, the enemy too many. Men shouted prayers and curses alike as they were driven back step by step, their feet slipping on blood-soaked stones. In the chaos, Emperor Constantine XI fought among them, his armor dented, his sword dull with use. Chroniclers say he tore the imperial insignia from his cloak, crying out, "The city is lost, but I live and die with my people." No one knows who struck him down, a janissary's blade, an arrow, or the crush of the fallen, but he disappeared into the storm, swallowed by history. Some say his body was never found, that he still lies beneath the ruins, waiting for his empire to rise again. The Ottomans surged forward, unstoppable now. They poured into the streets, shouting Allahu Akbar, as the defenders scattered toward the inner walls. The noise was deafening, cannon fire still echoing from beyond the walls. The clash of swords, the screams of the wounded, the cries of women and children running through the alleys. The city that had once been the jewel of the world was now a battlefield of flame and chaos. The final line of defense at the Mesopotamian collapsed as the Janissaries raised a crescent standard atop the walls. The banner of Byzantium, the double-headed eagle, was torn down, its silk trampled into the mud. In that moment, the Roman Empire, which had begun with Augustus and stretched across 3 continents, ceased to exist. The Queen of Cities was no more. Yet even as the sun broke through the smoke, illuminating the ruined domes and shattered gates, a heavy silence seemed to fall. The war was over, but the world that would follow had only just begun. Next, we move into the city itself, to the chaos, the terror and the sorrow that followed in the hours after Constantinople fell as the sun rose over. Constantinople on that fateful Tuesday morning. Its light revealed a city transformed into a nightmare. The golden domes that once glittered with divine brilliance now reflected only smoke and ruin. Streets that had carried emperors and saints for 1,000 years ran red with blood, and the sound of bells, once calling the faithful to prayer, were drowned out by the clash of steel and the cries of despair. The Ottomans had broken through the walls, and their soldiers fanned out through the Mazy, the great artery of the city, where centuries of history crumbled beneath their boots. Houses were burst open, their doors ripped from hinges as soldiers stormed inside, searching for gold, silver, and flesh. Venetian and Greek defenders, realizing the hopelessness of resistance, fled toward the harbor, only to find the sea itself burning with the reflection of fire from the waterfront. The cries of women, the wailing of children, and the guttural shouts of soldiers blended into a single, unending scream that seemed to echo through the very stones of the city. The air was thick with the scent of burning wood, gunpowder, and human fear. In Hagia Sophia, thousands of civilians gathered, clutching icons, whispering prayers, believing, or perhaps only hoping, that the ancient church would remain a sanctuary. They barred the doors, singing hymns that rose above the roar outside. But when the massive bronze gates were finally broken down, the holy sanctuary was swallowed by the tide of invaders. The marble floors, polished, smooth by a millennium of footsteps, were soon slick with blood. Witnesses wrote that the holy icons were torn from the walls, the crosses trampled underfoot, and the sacred relics carried off as spoils. Men were cut down where they stood, while women and children were bound in chains. The cries for mercy were answered only with laughter. Mehmed's troops, fueled by triumph and greed, surged through the streets without restraint. Constantinople, the second Rome, the city once said to be protected by God himself, was now a kingdom of smoke, ruin, and sorrow. And yet, amid this horror, something else stirred, a strange, almost sacred silence that crept through the broken streets, as if the city itself was mourning its own death. Next, we move to the heart of that silence, to the moment the Conqueror himself entered the fallen Queen of Cities. When Sultan Mehmed II entered the conquered city, the air was still heavy with smoke and dust, and the sound of distant screams drifted through the streets like ghosts of the old world refusing to die. He rode slowly through the shattered gates, surrounded by his generals and bodyguards, their armor gleaming faintly in the hazy light. The ground beneath the hooves of his horse was littered with broken weapons, torn banners, and the bodies of the fallen. The conqueror paused often, gazing at the ruins of a civilization that had once stood unbroken for more than 1,000 years. Chroniclers say that he did not smile, nor did he shout in triumph instead. His face was grave, even sorrowful, as he took in the desolation. He murmured a line from a Persian poet: "The spider weaves the curtains in the palace of kings. The owl calls the watch in the towers of Afrasiab. Even victory," it seemed, could not escape the weight of mortality. As he made his way toward the Augusteum, where the great church of Hagia Sophia stood, the sight before him was both awe-inspiring and pitiful. The once proud square was strewn with debris, the bronze statues of emperors toppled, the marble columns cracked. A few desperate civilians knelt before him, trembling, clutching icons or crosses as if these might protect them. Mehmed ordered his men to cease the killing. His city, as he called it now, must not be destroyed further. When he arrived at the doors of Hagia Sophia, they had already been smashed open. Inside he found a crowd of captives, men, women, and children, pressed together in terror, surrounded by soldiers. He dismounted, walked across the blood-stained marble floor, and gazed up at the immense dome. Light still filtered through the windows, illuminating mosaics of Christ and the saints. Mehmed, now master of the city, whispered softly, "La ilaha illallah," there is no God but God. Then he gave the order. The Hagia Sophia would be cleansed and converted into a mosque. The age of Byzantium was over. As the muezzin's call to prayer echoed for the first time through the ancient church, the city that had once been the heart of Christendom began its transformation into Istanbul, the new jewel of an empire reborn. But even in triumph, the ghosts of the old world lingered, whispering through the ruins, asking what price had been paid for this victory. For 3 days after the conquest, Constantinople existed in a strange twilight between worlds, a place neither living nor dead. The streets were filled with silence, broken only by the distant weeping of survivors and the rhythmic sound of boots on stone as soldiers dragged their spoils through the ruins. The fires still smoldered, painting the horizon red at dusk and grey at dawn. In the quarters of the city once filled with merchants, scholars, and monks, nothing moved but the wind. Houses stood open and ransacked, their walls blackened by smoke, their floors covered with shattered pottery and torn manuscripts. The once proud heart of Christendom had become a graveyard of memory. The scent of burning wood mixed with that of iron and decay. Stray dogs wandered the alleys, gnawing at the unburied dead. Those who had survived hid in cellars and crypts, clutching relics, whispering prayers that felt unanswered. When Mehmed's decree came that all looting should end, and that those who had escaped capture could return to their homes, few believed it. Many had no homes left to return to. The imperial palaces were stripped bare, the monasteries emptied of gold and books, their monks chained or gone. The church of Bloshany was nothing but walls, and in the heart of Hagia Sophia, where once hymns of praise had soared toward heaven, the echo of the muezzin now replaced the choir. The Conqueror ordered the rebuilding of the city, calling for artisans, masons, and scholars from across his realm to make Constantinople, now his Istanbul, a living capital again. He promised that Christians and Jews would live under his protection as long as they accepted his rule. Many who had fled crept cautiously back into the streets, finding the familiar turned alien. A Byzantine historian wrote that Mehmed walked through the city after the fires died, his eyes taking in the vast emptiness. "Behold what has been conquered," he is said to have whispered, not with pride, but with a kind of melancholy. For in the silence of Constantinople's ruins, even the conqueror could hear the voice of time, the same voice that whispers to all empires that their glory, too, will one day crumble into dust. The city had fallen, but in its ashes, a new world was beginning to stir. When word of Constantinople's fall reached Europe, it spread like a tremor through every court, cathedral, and marketplace. Messengers rode across mountains and rivers, carrying tidings that sounded almost impossible. The queen of cities, the second Rome, had fallen. In Venice, the bells tolled in mourning. In Rome, the Pope was said to have wept. Across the Christian world, horror and disbelief turned to fear. For more than 1,000 years, Constantinople had stood as the shield of Christendom, guarding Europe from the east. Now, that shield lay shattered. Rumors multiplied faster than truth, that the Sultan's armies would march next on Vienna, that the churches of Italy would soon fall beneath the crescent, that the prophecy of the world ending in fire was beginning. Scholars and clerics debated what it meant. Some said it was divine punishment for the sins of kings and popes. Others claimed it was a sign that God's favor had shifted eastward, toward a new faith rising under the banner of the Ottomans. Pope Pius II called for a crusade, his voice echoing through Europe's cathedrals, urging Christian princes to unite as their ancestors had done. But his words fell on ears grown weary of war. France, England, and the Holy Roman Empire were consumed by their own feuds, their treasuries drained, their faith dulled by politics. The great powers looked eastward with pity, not resolve. "We have lost not a city, but the world's light," one Italian humanist wrote, "and the sun itself seems dimmed." Some looked for meaning in the stars. Others searched old prophecies, hoping for a sign that the lost empire might one day rise again. In the monasteries, monks copied accounts of the siege with trembling hands, as if to preserve the last heartbeat of Byzantium. To many, it was the day the Middle Ages truly died, when faith gave way to fear and the divine order of Christendom was broken. Yet from the ashes of despair came something else, a wave of exiles carrying ancient texts and forgotten wisdom westward. Unknowingly, the same catastrophe that ended one age was setting the stage for another. The Renaissance, the rebirth of light from the heart of ruin, was about to begin, carried on the breath of refugees from the fallen city, as the smoke still hung over Constantinople. The survivors who escaped the massacre fled westward, carrying little more than what they could hide in their clothes: manuscripts, relics, and memories of a world that no longer existed. Among them were priests, scribes, and philosophers, the last heirs of Greece and Rome, men who had guarded knowledge that stretched back to Aristotle, Euclid, and Ptolemy. Their libraries had burned, but their minds were living archives. They crossed the sea to Italy, settling in Venice, Florence, and Rome, where they began to teach a generation of curious young minds the language of the ancients. For centuries, Europe had known only fragments of the classical world, filtered through Latin and religion. Now, these exiles brought with them the full tapestry, the philosophies of Plato, the mathematics of Archimedes, the medical treatises of Galen. Their arrival ignited something that had been sleeping in Europe's heart: hunger for knowledge, beauty, and mastery of the human mind. The Medici family in Florence, already patrons of art and scholarship, opened their doors to these refugees, funding translations and lectures that revived the wisdom of antiquity. Suddenly, Italy became the new Constantinople, a crossroads of old and new worlds. Painters began to study geometry to perfect perspective. Architects studied Vitruvius to rebuild with balance and grace, and poets rediscovered the lost art of human emotion. The Byzantine scholars, often dressed in robes that made them look like ghosts from another century, became teachers to men who would soon change the course of history. Men like Leonardo da Vinci, Botticelli, and Michelangelo. In their classrooms, the boundaries between faith and reason began to blur, and the sacred gave way to the sublime. Yet behind their lectures and art lay an unspoken grief. They had lost their home, their empire, their language of faith and power. Each time they spoke of Byzantium, they spoke of it like a lost paradise. "We built with gold and fell by fire," one scholar wrote before dying in exile. Still, their loss became the world's gain. From the ashes of Constantinople, Europe rediscovered itself. The Renaissance, often thought to have sprung from Italy's soil, had in truth been seeded by the blood of Byzantium's fall, proof that even in ruin, civilization finds a way to survive. As the refugees spread across Europe, whispers of Constantinople's fall reached every court, monastery, and marketplace. To some, it was a tragedy of faith, the end of Christendom's Eastern guardian. To others, it was a divine warning, a sign that no city, no empire could stand forever. In Rome, the Pope declared days of mourning. In Venice, merchants wept not just for the souls lost, but for the silks, spices, and fortunes now cut off by Ottoman control. In Paris and London, priests thundered from their pulpits, urging kings to launch a new crusade. But Europe, fractured and exhausted by its own wars, did nothing. The Holy Roman Emperor sent condolences, not soldiers. The French king prayed, but quietly. Only in Spain, where the Reconquista was nearing its end, did some see an opportunity to unite the Christian world under one banner once again. But no such banner rose. Instead, what came was silence, and then something unexpected: adaptation. Western kingdoms, cut off from the overland routes that had once carried goods through Constantinople, turned their eyes toward the sea. If the road to the east was blocked by the Turks, perhaps the ocean held another path. In this way, the fall of a city gave birth to an age of exploration. Men like Prince Henry the Navigator began charting new routes along Africa's coast. A century later, Columbus would sail west, chasing the shadows of a dream born from Constantinople's ruin. And while Europe looked outward, the Ottomans looked inward. Their empire swelled with the riches of trade, and the Hagia Sophia, once filled with hymns, now echoed with the call to prayer. Yet the West could not forget. Painters began depicting the fall as apocalypse, angels turning their faces away, demons rising over domes of fire. Historians wrote of it as the day the light went out in the east. But in that same darkness, the spark of curiosity grew brighter. Philosophers asked why a city so strong had fallen, why faith alone could not save it. Their questions, whispered in universities and taverns alike, became the foundation for a new way of thinking. It was as if the echo of Constantinople's fall had traveled through time itself, awakening Europe to its next great transformation. Within the heart of his new empire, Sultan Mehmed II stood before the great dome of Hagia Sophia, no longer the house of wisdom of the Byzantines, but now the jewel of Islam. The massive structure still smelled faintly of incense and smoke from the siege, the gold mosaics shimmering faintly through the thin veil of plaster soon to cover them. Mehmed gazed at the domed ceiling and whispered verses from the Quran, his voice echoing softly in the cavernous hall. He was only 21, but already the world bowed to him as Mehmed the Conqueror. To his soldiers, he was divinely chosen. To his enemies, he was the Antichrist. Yet the truth was far more complex. Mehmed was not merely a warrior. He was a scholar, fluent in Greek, Latin, Persian, and Arabic. He read histories of Alexander and Caesar, studied geometry, philosophy, and engineering. Where others saw destruction, he saw rebirth. He envisioned Constantinople as the capital of a new empire that would bridge the world, not only in land, but in spirit. Under his rule, the city would become Istanbul, a name that whispered both power and eternity. The streets were rebuilt, markets revived, and scholars invited to return. Mehmed's architects restored aqueducts and palaces, while his masons repaired walls still scarred by cannon fire. Yet for every act of creation, there was an act of dominance. The crosses were taken down. The relics of saints were removed. The call to prayer echoed from the minarets that rose where bells once rang. And so, the city of emperors became the city of sultans. Mehmed walked its streets, dressed not as a barbarian conqueror, but as a ruler of civilization. He called himself Caesar of Rome, claiming succession not only by conquest, but by inheritance. In his eyes, he had not destroyed Rome, he had reclaimed it. Still, the shadow of the past lingered in every stone. The air was heavy with both triumph and mourning, a paradox that defined the city forever. Mehmed's vision was vast, to extend his empire beyond the Bosporus, to march into Europe itself, to carry the crescent where once stood the cross. In the minds of his followers, the prophecy had shifted. The seat of empire had merely changed hands, not ended. The eternal city had fallen, and yet, somehow, lived on in the years that followed Mehmed's conquest. The new Istanbul became something the world had never seen before, a city balanced between two civilizations, two faiths, two destinies. It pulsed with contradictions. The scent of roasted coffee and incense drifted through narrow streets where Byzantine marble columns stood beside freshly painted Ottoman arches. The muezzin's call to prayer mingled with the faint. Latin hymns whispered by hidden Christians, still mourning their lost churches. The city's skyline transformed, domes and minarets rising like a crown of stone and gold over the Bosporus, while ships from every direction crowded its harbors. Greek merchants, Persian scholars, Arab poets, and Italian traders all found their way here, drawn by a strange new gravity that seemed to pull east and west toward each other. Mehmed II encouraged this convergence. He reopened the city's universities, filling them with theologians, astronomers, and historians. The libraries once guarded by Byzantine monks now held books in Arabic and Turkish alongside the works of Aristotle and Euclid. A new culture was being forged in real time, neither purely Islamic nor purely Byzantine, but something hybrid, fluid, and alive. The Hagia Sophia stood at the center of this transformation, its mosaics partially hidden but not erased, its vast dome still shimmering in the half-light, like a reminder that beauty transcends faith. Travelers who came to Istanbul spoke of its contradictions in awe. Venetian envoys wrote of streets alive with silken spices, while Persian poets called it the mirror of heaven on earth. But beneath the splendor, a quiet unease stirred. The Christians who had survived the fall lived under heavy tribute, their churches repurposed or destroyed, their traditions fading into silence. Some converted to survive, others fled deeper into Europe, carrying their sorrow like a secret wound. And yet, Even they could not deny the strange majesty of the new empire that had risen in their place. For the first time since Rome, one ruler held the keys to two continents. Istanbul was no longer merely a city, it was an idea, a living symbol of empire reborn. But as centuries would prove, it was also a fault line, where two worlds would forever meet and forever clash. In the heart of Istanbul, beneath the towering dome of Hagia Sophia, a strange silence took hold. The chanting of monks and the ringing of bells had vanished, replaced by the soft, haunting echoes of footsteps on marble floors polished by centuries of prayer. Candles no longer flickered before icons. Instead, sunlight filtered through narrow windows, illuminating the faint outlines of angels painted high above, their faces half hidden under layers of plaster. The transformation of the great church was not just architectural, it was spiritual, almost cosmic. For nearly 1,000 years, Hagia Sophia had stood as the center of Orthodox Christianity, its dome seen as the meeting place between heaven and earth. Now it was a mosque, its mosaics veiled but not forgotten. To the conquerors, it symbolized divine favor, proof that Allah had granted victory over the infidels. To the conquered, it was heartbreak made visible, a monument to what had been lost. And yet, despite the pain, Hagia Sophia remained alive. Its walls held the prayers of both empires, its stones soaked in centuries of devotion. Even the imams who led the first prayers beneath its dome spoke of awe rather than destruction, as if they, too, felt the lingering holiness in the air. Over time, its new identity solidified. Minarets rose like sentinels at its corners, the call to prayer carried over the Bosporus, and carpets softened the cold marble where emperors once knelt. But legends persisted, whispers that at the moment the Turks entered, an angel had hidden the last Christian priest within the walls, where he would remain until the church became a church again. Travelers who visited centuries later claimed they could still feel something sacred there, something neither Muslim nor Christian but eternal. Hagia Sophia became a paradox, a building too vast for one faith, too old for one empire, too beautiful to die. The people of Istanbul, whether conquerors or conquered, came to see it as a kind of heart, one that had changed rhythm but never stopped beating. The silence that filled it was not emptiness, but waiting, as if the great church itself knew that history would one day shift again, and its voice, long buried, would be heard once more. The fall of Constantinople cast a shadow across Europe that stretched far beyond the battlefield. News of the city's fall traveled slowly, carried by trembling merchants and weary sailors, until it reached the great courts of Europe. Kings and queens listened in silence as messengers spoke of the walls that could not hold, of the emperor who died sword in hand, of the cross torn down from the Hagia Sophia. For some, it was unthinkable. The city that had stood as the last bastion of Christendom, now in Muslim hands. In monasteries and cathedrals, bells tolled in mourning. Priests thundered from their pulpits, warning that the end of days might be near. Prophets emerged from the streets, declaring that God had abandoned his people. Even the scholars of Europe, normally grounded in logic, began to whisper of omens, comets that burned too bright, earthquakes that shook too violently. But while faith trembled, politics began to stir. The kings of the West looked at one another with suspicion, each waiting for another to act. Pope Nicholas V called for a crusade, but the age of crusaders was gone. The knights of France and England were weary from their own wars. The Italian city-states, too concerned with trade to risk their fleets. The Holy Roman Emperor sent letters of outrage, but offered no armies. The truth was bitter. The unity that could have saved Constantinople was already broken long before the city fell. And so Europe, that ancient continent of crowns and cathedrals, turned inward, consumed by its rivalries, even as a new power rose to the east. Yet among the few who understood the gravity of what had happened, a deeper fear began to form. If the Ottomans could take Constantinople, what would stop them from taking Rome, or Vienna, or Paris? Maps were redrawn in candlelight, borders reconsidered, alliances reimagined. And though no army marched immediately, the hearts of Europe hardened. The myth of Christian invincibility had died, replaced by a desperate vigilance. Painters depicted the fall as apocalypse. Poets wrote of it as divine punishment, and yet beneath the grief, there was admiration too for the force, the brilliance, and the inevitability of the empire that had replaced Byzantium. Europe would On the final night before the walls gave way, Emperor Constantine, the 11th Palaiologos, stood atop the ramparts of his doomed city, watching the dark horizon flicker with the glow of Ottoman torches. The sounds of war, the thud of cannonballs, the cries of soldiers, the murmuring prayers blended into something almost sacred, a requiem for the dying empire he ruled. He wore no crown, only armor dented and dulled from weeks of battle. Around him stood priests and peasants, nobles and foreigners, all bound by the same fate. The emperor had refused to flee, despite pleas from his advisors and allies. God forbid, he had said, that I live as an emperor without an empire. His words had spread through the ranks like fire, rekindling courage in hearts already hollowed by despair. That night, the final service was held in Hagia Sophia. The great church, illuminated by trembling candlelight, was filled with every soul that could still walk. Greeks, Latins, and soldiers of every kind stood together, setting aside centuries of division. For the first time in 1,000 years, they prayed as one, not for victory, but for mercy. The emperor himself knelt before the altar, confessing his sins and asking forgiveness for his people. When he rose, those who saw him said he looked calm, even radiant, as if already belonging to another world. At dawn, he returned to the walls, sword in hand. The Ottomans surged forward, their cannons roaring like thunder, their banners glinting red beneath the morning sun. Constantine fought among his men, shouting, striking, bleeding, a ruler turned soldier, a symbol turned man. No one knows exactly how he died. Some say he was cut down near the gate of St. Romanus. Others believe his body was never found because the angels took him, turning him to marble beneath the city to wait for Byzantium's return. The conquerors searched for his remains, but found only legend. In time, the people began to whisper that one day the marble emperor would awaken, sword in hand, when the city was free again. And so, even in death, Constantine remained not as a corpse, but as a promise. When the final gates fell and the tide of soldiers poured into Constantinople, the morning air thickened with a smoke that would haunt the city for generations. The Golden Horn, once glimmering with sunlight and sails, now burned red with reflection from the fires consuming the city's heart. Palaces crackled, churches smoldered, and the marble streets turned black with soot and blood. The Ottomans moved through the ruins with both fury and wonder, looting treasures, smashing icons, and claiming the remnants of an empire that had once ruled the known world. Yet even amid the chaos, there were moments of eerie stillness, as if the city itself were holding its breath. The great bronze doors of Hagia Sophia were forced open, and Mehmed's soldiers entered the sacred space in awe, where candles had once flickered before golden icons. Now the light came from torches, their smoke swirling against the ancient dome. In the distance, the cries of the dying mingled with the chanting of the victors. The line between conquest and catastrophe blurred. No one could tell where glory ended and ruin began. By evening, the fires had spread so far that the city's walls glowed as if lit from within. The mosaics of saints melted into rivers of color. The libraries burned with the quiet fury of lost memory. Centuries of history books, maps, manuscripts turned to ash in hours. The Byzantines who survived stumbled through the ruins in disbelief, clutching children, relics, anything that hadn't been taken. The conquerors herded them together, marking them for ransom or slavery. And yet, amid the ruin, there was order. When Sultan Mehmed II entered the city on horseback, he commanded that the looting stop. He dismounted at the door of Hagia Sophia, stooped to gather a handful of its dust, and let it fall through his fingers. "Now it is ours," he said softly, more to himself than to his generals. The fires were extinguished, but the scent of smoke lingered for weeks. It clung to the stone, to the fabric of tents, to the memories of those who lived through that day. For them, the world had ended not with the sound of battle, but with the slow, consuming whisper of fire. When dawn rose over the ruined city, it did so upon silence, not the peace of victory, but the hollow quiet that follows devastation. Constantinople, the jewel of empires, the city of 1,000 domes, lay still beneath a veil of smoke. Seagulls circled above the harbor, where broken masts jutted from the water like splintered bones. The streets that once echoed with prayers, footsteps, and the hum of merchants were now littered with rubble, spent arrows, and the remnants of shattered lives. The few survivors crept out from their hiding places, dazed, their faces streaked with ash and tears. Some wandered toward the Hagia Sophia, drawn by habit, by faith, or perhaps by the faint hope that the great church might still offer sanctuary. But inside, they found a different world, one transformed overnight from cathedral to mosque. The marble floors were smeared with blood and dust, the icons covered, the air heavy with the residue of smoke and incense. Ottoman soldiers stood guard where priests once prayed. In one corner, a group of captives wept silently, clutching each other as if afraid to let go. Outside, the Sultan's banners fluttered in the breeze, their colors stark against the pale sky. Mehmed had already begun the work of rebuilding, restoring order, counting the spoils, reassigning the living. Slaves were divided, homes catalogued, gold weighed. Yet, amid this administrative calm, the air still trembled with something unspoken, a grief too vast to name. The emperor was gone, his body lost to history, perhaps buried under the rubble, perhaps lying forgotten among the dead. The last echo of Byzantine pride had vanished with him. From the far hills, the sound of Ottoman horns carried faintly across the water, a lament and a proclamation all at once. The Middle Ages had ended in that sound, and something new had begun. The people who remained, Greeks, Armenians, Jews, and Latins, looked around at their broken city and saw both an ending and a strange, uncertain beginning. The air was cold, the sky grey, and somewhere in the distance, a hammer struck stone, the first note in the long rebuilding of a city that would live again, though never as it once had. Legends soon began to rise from the ruins like smoke. In the taverns of Athens, in the monasteries of Mount Athos, in the markets of Venice, Whispers spread that Emperor Constantine XI had not truly died. Some said an angel had descended in the moment of his fall, shrouding him in marble and carrying him beneath the Golden Gate to sleep until the day Constantinople would be Christian again. Others claimed his sword had been found glowing in the rubble, a sign that his spirit still guarded the city. These tales comforted a people stripped of everything but memory. The Greeks began to speak of the marble emperor, a figure trapped between life and death, between loss and redemption. For them, he became a promise that their empire might one day rise again, even if the man himself never did. In the Ottoman court, Mehdi dismissed these stories publicly, yet he too was haunted by the legend. He had walked the streets of his new capital, seen the statues of emperors past, and felt the weight of centuries pressing upon him. Some say he would wander the halls of the Blosheny Palace at night, running his hands along the broken mosaics, whispering to the ghosts of those who ruled before him. To Mehmed, conquering Constantinople was more than victory, it was inheritance. He declared himself Kaiser-i-Rum, Caesar of Rome, claiming the mantle of the very empire he had destroyed. But the title was heavy, and even his triumph could not silence the echo of the fallen emperor's name. Across Christendom, poets and priests mourned Constantine as the last of Rome's heirs. His death marked more than the end of a dynasty. It was the end of an age. The world that believed in holy empires and divine crowns had died on those walls. In its place, something more pragmatic, more merciless, and more modern was beginning to stir. The Renaissance would soon bloom in the West, fueled in part by the scholars and refugees who fled the wreckage of Constantinople, carrying ancient knowledge to new lands. Yet even as the light of new learning dawned, the shadow of the last In the weeks that followed the city's fall, a quiet procession began, not of soldiers or slaves, but of scholars. Cloaked in the dust of a fallen empire, men who had once lectured in marble halls gathered their manuscripts, their instruments, and their memories, and fled westward across the sea. They carried with them the remnants of a civilization, scrolls of Aristotle and Plato, codices of medicine and astronomy, the mathematical works of Euclid and Archimedes, the forgotten plays of Sophocles. These were not just books. They were living embers of a world that had burned for 1,000 years. When they reached the ports of Italy, Venice, Florence, Genoa, they were received not as refugees, but as treasures. The West, still recovering from its own darkness, suddenly found itself face to face with the brilliance of ancient Greece reborn through the Byzantines. In the candlelit studies of Florence, men like Cosimo de' Medici listened to these wandering Greeks speak of philosophy, art, and the divine harmony of the cosmos. One of them, John Argyropoulos, would teach the Greek language to a generation of thinkers who would ignite the Renaissance. Another, Constantine Lascaris, brought the first printed Greek grammar to Europe, spreading the old wisdom like wildfire through the presses. The fall of Constantinople, which had seemed like the death of civilization, was in truth its transformation. Knowledge that might have been lost beneath Ottoman stone instead flowed into new hands, into new minds, awakening Europe from its long medieval sleep. Yet for the scholars themselves, it was not triumph but exile. They wrote of Constantinople with tears, of the sound of the Bosphorus at dawn, of the domes that caught the morning sun, of the libraries turned to ash. Some refused to learn the new languages, clinging instead to the purity of their own lost tongue. They lived as strangers among the Italians, teaching and translating, always looking east when the wind carried the scent of the sea. The Renaissance, that golden rebirth of reason and beauty, was in many ways the ghost of Byzantium, its soul reborn in the West, even as its body lay buried beneath the crescent moon of the East. In the years that followed, the echo of the conquest reverberated across two worlds, Christian and Muslim, East and West, cross and crescent. For Europe, the fall of Constantinople was a wound that never fully healed. In Rome, Pope Nicholas V wept at the news, declaring it the death of the ancient world and the birth of a darker age. He called for a crusade, though no army ever came. The kingdoms of the West were too fractured, too suspicious of one another to unite under a single cause. France, England, the Holy Roman Empire, all were busy with their own wars and ambitions. The age of holy unity was gone. In its place stood the age of power, trade, and discovery. Yet, in the East, beneath the rising crescent of Islam, there was celebration unlike any the world had seen. From Cairo to Damascus, from Mecca to Samarkand, news of the conquest spread like sacred fire. Poets wrote verses praising the young sultan as the fulfiller of prophecy, the conqueror of the unconquerable. In the mosques, imams spoke of Mehmed's triumph as proof that God's will had prevailed, that the once mighty Rome had finally bowed to the truth of Islam. But within the walls of the Hajia, Sophia now echoing with Arabic prayers, a strange duality lingered. The very stones of the church still whispered in Greek, even as new voices rose in Turkish. Mosaics of saints were covered, yet not destroyed, as if the conquerors understood that to erase them completely would be to erase part of their own victory. Mehmed himself would often stand beneath the great dome, silent, listening. He admired its beauty, its impossible architecture, and perhaps, in that silence, he felt both conqueror and heir. For in his mind, the Ottoman Empire was not merely a replacement for Byzantium. It was its continuation under a new name, its blood carried forward in a different vessel. And so the city endured, reborn as Istanbul, bridge of worlds, capital of empires, the heart of a new age. Yet the balance between faith and ambition, between crescent and cross, would never truly settle. Constantinople had fallen, but its story, its spirit, would continue to haunt both worlds for centuries to come, the glittering heart of Ottoman power. But beneath its golden domes and sprawling bazaars lay a silence only the old could hear. The Greeks who remained whispered that the city still belonged to the ghosts of Byzantine emperors who walked the ruined corridors of Bloshany Palace at night, priests who chanted beneath the ground where the Hagia Sophia's crypts still rested. Travelers spoke of flickering lights seen in the old cisterns, the voices of monks echoing faintly where the sea walls met the Bosporus. Mehmed, though hailed as the conqueror, was not immune to this haunting. He often wandered the ruins of the ancient palaces, touching broken marble columns, tracing the outlines of mosaics buried under soot and time. He would ask his scholars about the men who once ruled here, Constantine, Justinian, Theodora, their names like spells from another world. His fascination grew into obsession. He ordered that the old manuscripts of Byzantium be gathered, their knowledge translated into Turkish and Arabic. He kept Greek philosophers in his court, debated them under candlelight, as if trying to summon the intellect of the fallen empire back to life through language. Yet even in this act of preservation, something darker took root. The city's conquered spirit did not rest quietly beneath Ottoman grandeur. It bled into it an undercurrent of melancholy, a sense that every empire, no matter how divine it claimed to be, stood only upon the ashes of the one before. As new mosques rose over old churches, as the call to prayer replaced the ringing of bells, a strange harmony began to form, not peace, but coexistence of memory. The ghosts of Byzantium did not resist the living. They watched them, teaching them, reminding them. Istanbul was no longer just a city. It was a mirror, showing every ruler his own mortality. Mehmed's court chroniclers recorded victories, but they also wrote of nights when the Sultan would stare at the Bosporus in silence, the wind carrying whispers from across the water, whispers that spoke not of glory, but of the endless cycle that all empires are destined to repeat.